I had a question for you, Timothy. Tell us how you got into
Yeah.
freedom. I got into liberty and the whole movement. Ron Paul and all that stuff. How did you get into it in the first place? What led you to that?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking, Jay. So I've always kind of been half awake, but I've been half brainwashed, too. Like when Ross Perot was running before in the early 90s, I was in 7th grade, and he was the only person talking about getting out of debt, and the media was, like, making fun of him and that, that he was that was one of his issues. And I'm like, well, I knew the reason why they were making fun of him is because, they were trying to brainwash people against that issue, But it wasn't until and so, and then, Bush and Gore running in 2000, someone asked me, well, who are you going to vote for? I'm like, neither one, because they're basically the same, And, but it wasn't until a couple of years ago, I just was watching some YouTube videos, and Ron Paul was talking about why we shouldn't do preemptive or aggressive wars and why it's anti-Christian. And I just started crying my eyes out because I knew what he was saying was true. And then he started talking about our God-given rights and something so basic, but I never 100% understood it until then, about our God-given rights of life, liberty, property, privacy, that nothing can infringe on those. Those are our rights that God gave us. And then everything started making sense to me. I'm like, oh, yeah. And, it was like, direct taxes are unconstitutional. They're illegal because they're taxes on your rights. Like income tax is a tax on your life because it's a tax on your labor. You own your labor. You own your life. God gave you your life, not the government. So the government doesn't have any right to tax you on your labor. They don't own you. And so, that's all this stuff started making sense because I was always asking, in elementary school, about taxation without representation. And I'm like, well, why we have all these taxes today, and we're learning about how we threw the tea into the harbor and why that was good. That was taxation without representation. But aren't all these other taxes also taxation without representation? But no one could really answer that question for me, And it wasn't until because they never really taught me in school about we have God-given rights and what those rights are and what it means, and what those rights mean and that they can't be infringed on. And it wasn't until I started watching those videos on Ron Paul that I finally got it. And then once I understood that basic thing, then everything else started making sense. And I saw, the wolves in sheep's clothing and the New World Order agenda and everything like night and day, like light and dark. It became so obvious, whereas before there was gray areas. Now there's no gray areas. It's it's not hard to see once you understand those basic fundamentals. And anyways, and it got me really excited because I know before we were born there was a war in heaven. It was in the scriptures, Satan proposed his plan of he was going to force everybody to do what was right, which is basically slavery. We got the NSA now spying on us to force us to do what's right. It's just Satan's plan just happening right in front of our eyes, Anyways, but Satan had his plan. Jesus had his plan of liberty and free agency, and that's what I really like Duke talking about free agency earlier on the show. He's 100% correct. They both gave their sides of the plan. And it was a war of testimonies, and we were there, and we knew that liberty was the way to go, and we shared our testimonies why, and now we're here on earth, and we promised God that we would come down at this time, and we would fight for liberty again. And so once I understood those things that Ron Paul was talking about, I'm seriously got this fire inside me like nothing before. I'm like, whoa, I got to get out there. I got to do what I can to fight for liberty and share my testimonies of free agency and liberty, just like we did before we were born, And so I had to fulfill that promise that I made before we came down here, and that's what you guys are doing on the radio, and Alex Jones, and anybody. If you feel inspired to do something, do it. Like my friend John Locke, his last name is L-O-C-K-E. He's got a YouTube channel that, he's trying to spread the message of liberty, and his YouTube channel is Team Wake 'em Up. And then my friend Dan Hagen, he's a musician. He's just spreading the message of liberty through his talents of music.